In speaking about theosophy as a spiritual path, it's useful to understand what theosophy means. And to get at the meaning of any word, it's beneficial to look at its roots. Theosophy comes from the Latin root, theos, meaning God or the divine, and Sophie or Sophia, meaning wisdom or knowledge. So theosophy means divine wisdom. This is the ancient wisdom or the perennial wisdom that is known and expressed throughout time. So what does theosophy cover? So this is from Blavatsky. Theosophy covers information about the nature of a human being, both physically and beyond what the physical senses can see or touch. It also includes the laws and principles of nature and of life, such as karma, reincarnation, the angelic world, and what happens when we die. It covers questions of why am I here? What's my purpose or my place in the world? And it teaches about the origin and evolution of the world and a human being. Also, theosophy is contained in the essence of the religions and spiritual traditions of the world, not necessarily their dogmas, but also the wise adages and aphorisms that are handed down throughout the generations. Now, Helena Petrovna Blavatsky, or HPB as we call her, is one of the founders of the Theosophical Society in 1875, and she's author of The Secret Doctrine. And she speaks to what is theosophy or the divine wisdom. This is her picture when she was a young woman, and then as she was older, seriously writing The Secret Doctrine. So she says theosophy is the uninterrupted record of thousands of seers whose experiences verify the traditions passed down orally and who watch over humanity. So what is a spiritual path? What does it mean to be on the path? It is said that a person is on the spiritual path when they commit themselves to living a life dedicated to study, prayer, meditation, devotional reading, that's optional in a way, but the development of selflessness. It comes down to living in harmony with the spiritual higher self. And theosophists have coined the metaphor of it being a three-legged stool of meditation, study, and service. But in a deeper sense, being on the path means that the person is committed to speeding up their development so they can realize the inner spiritual self. But what I have learned with talking to and reading what mystics or spiritual teachers have to say on this is that everyone is on the path. All we do contributes to our spiritual development, whether we're consciously trying to improve ourselves or develop or not. The things that we do that don't turn out so well, we learn from right away and we try not to do them again. Or the things that we do well, we also learn from those and they make us feel good. And often it's from a sense of love, and it can be love of work. But all of this leads us to acquire even more skills, and we have a greater awareness of ourselves and others. So we learn simply by living. Mariana Williamson, the spiritual teacher who taught about the book A Course in Miracles in the 1990s, said, "Everyone is on a spiritual path. Most people just don't know it." This means that our spiritual development takes place even if we don't have any spiritual practices. We grow no matter what. We don't have to be an ascetic and go off to a monastery to develop ourselves. And HPB makes this point. The Hindu yogi who isolates himself in an impenetrable forest, like the Christian hermit who retires to the desert, are both but accomplished egoists. The one acts with the sole idea of finding nirvana, in nirvana, refuge against reincarnation. The other acts with the unique idea of saving his soul. Both of them think only of themselves. They're personal. Their motive is altogether personal. This is also emphasized in the theosophical classic, The Voice of the Silence. Believe thou not in sitting in dark forests, in proud seclusion and apart from men, will lead thee to the goal of final liberation. Sow kindly acts, and thou shalt reap their fruition. This is how we progress. Blavatsky emphasizes that we must live theosophy in our daily lives when she says, Theosophy must not represent merely a collection of moral verities, a bundle of metaphysical ethics epitomized in theoretical dissertations. Theosophy must be made practical. It has to find objective expression in an all-embracing code of life, thoroughly impregnated with the spirit of mutual tolerance, charity, and love. These qualities are what we're taught to live by, particularly charity or altruism. Annie Besant, the second international president of the Theosophical Society and the first national president of the Theosophical Society in America. She wrote The Spiritual Life, a book that's very useful with her knowledge and her understanding of the theosophy. She said that for a person, it is his duty to live and act in the very spot in which he finds himself in. There lies the duty for which he has come to birth and which he should perfectly discharge. And then Dogen Keegan, the 13th century Japanese Zen master and founder of the Soto Zen school in Japan, said, "The place is here. The way leads everywhere. Everyone will make their own spiritual path." Annie Besant, again in The Spiritual Life, says, "The life of devotion will begin at home, in all the brightness that can be brought into it, and in lightening the burdens of others. And then from the life of the home to the wider world outside, giving there his best, never asking, would I not rather do something else? The best that he can give is that which he wills to give. Out of that life of service will come the purifying fire of devotion. That fire is from the inner spiritual self." This is similar to Mother Teresa of Calcutta's advice. What can you do to promote world peace? Go home and love your family. In her book, The Spiritual Life, Annie Besant maintains that it's an error in thinking that the spiritual life has to be lived, can't be lived in the everyday world, that the religious and the secular or the worldly need to be kept apart. She says, The world is the thought of God, the expression of the divine mind. All work done in the world is God's work, or none is his at all. The merchant in his counting house, or the shopman behind the counter, the doctor in the hospital are quite as much engaged in divine activity as any preacher in his church. So Annie Besant's book, The Spiritual Life, is a collection of lectures that she gave throughout her life, and she's aware of the audience and that most or many believe in God. Hence her reference to God's work. But Theosophy through HPB teaches that instead of the concept of an anthropomorphized God, the divine is a principle. And HPB defines God, or this principle, as the one life, the eternal, invisible, yet omnipresent, without beginning or end, unconscious yet absolute consciousness, the unrealizable, the one self-existing reality. We can't describe this or cognize it. It's above that. It's beyond our minds. So cultures around the world may use various terms to refer to this, such as the God of the Christians, Ahura Mazda of the Zoroastrians of Persia, Allah of Islam, Brahman of the Hindus, Wakantankan, the Native Americans, or the great architect of the universe, the Masons. The principle of the one life is present in a human being and in everything in the world. Theosophy teaches that it's represented by the word Atman, and this is Sanskrit. And Blavatsky taught us about the levels of consciousness within a human being. So I have a couple charts that will help us understand this and also see how it's split in a person. So first of all, you can see the column of the Sanskrit starts with Atman. And this is our connection to the absolute or God or the plane of unity. Then we go to Buddhi, and that's the field of intuition. And we're moving down in density in a human being. So then we reach Manas, and this includes the higher and lower mind. And my second chart will describe a little bit more about this. Then lower in density is Kama, or the desire body. That's the emotions. Then Prana, the pranic body, or the life force. This is vitality. And it's the energy within and coming off the body. And you may have heard of the Chinese term qi. That's this prana, or ki in Japan, say like in Reiki. And then in the second, almost to the physical body, but it's the linga sharira, it's the vital body, or the etheric double. And we can actually feel it with heat, but also we can get a sense of energy that's emanating off the body if we put our hand about a half an inch from it. Then lastly, we have the Sthula Sharira, or the physical body. And this next chart shows a difference between the spiritual self, or the higher self, and the everyday self, or the personal self. So the higher self is the Atman, the field of unity, and it has Buddhi, the field of intuition, and it includes the higher mind of Buddhi Manas. So that's how they use Manas with the higher mind. And that's the intuition and higher reasoning. And I just may point out that this is instantaneous, this flashes of insight that we may get. And if you think of a family member that you may spot waking up in the morning, maybe they're sick, and you instantly know that something is wrong. That's your intuition, being able to read their body and behavior. Then we move into the everyday self, and that's the everyday mind that plans our schedules and goes to the grocery store and organizes our life. And this is the lower mind, kama manas. Then the emotions, and that's kama, and that's the desires we have or things that we think of to make our lives work better. And then, of course, the physical body and the body mind. Now, Blavatsky calls this the brain mind, but I just want to comment a little bit on the body mind. Now, we need that. It's so important. It's at the top of the brain stem. It's not in the higher mind of us. And it's the part of us that if we touch a hot stove, we immediately pull our hand away. And if we're driving a car, we know how to drive. And if the red light comes on, even if we're thinking of 1,000 other things, we make a perfect stop. And then the body mind's our autonomic nervous system. It's our digestion, or our heart speeds up when we run. But it's important to know this, that the body mind is also our defenses that are tied to our emotions. And if we have some disputes with somebody, the body mind is what kicks in when we may get argumentative or raise our voice or get quiet, sullen. And so this is what much of the teachings of the spirituality help us work with, is this body mind. So being on the spiritual path, we realize these levels of consciousness are within us, and we understand the implication of the seventh or the highest principle of Atman. We all are all part of Atman. There's no your Atman and my Atman. Everything is immersed in the same field. This means that everyone around us is akin to us. There's no separation at the higher levels of consciousness. We truly are one. And realizing this can really help us so that we don't get stuck in that body mind. So this oneness is reflected in the Islamic teachings of Muhammad when he said, "Everywhere you look is God's face." And LBN Arabi, "The soul sees God in all beings, but only because it is God who is doing the looking." And he was a 12th century mystic and poet and philosopher. To live in a way that reflects this oneness, spiritual teachers teach us that an important aspect of this is what goes on in our minds. We need to be aware of our thinking and realize it is faulty if it's based on the premise that there's a separation between people. There's not an us or them, or you over there and me. So we'll take a look at the mental body and then discuss how it relates to the emotions. So when we think, we produce energy in our minds and on the mental plane, which cause vibrations that are called thought forms. The vibrations produce shapes and colors, and clairvoyant people can see these things. And there's a definiteness of form depending on how clear or intense the thought was. Teachers say succinctly and literally, thoughts are things. When we habitually think the same thoughts, the resulting thought form is produced quickly, true to that form, because a vibratory habit has set up in our minds. These are the patterns of thinking that we often go through. This is in the mental body and is called a neural groove in current terminology. And so this is even said in the trainings I take that I must take as to keep my license up. So they may be talking about the neurology of the brain and all, and it's called a neural groove. And so when we, on the other hand, when we need to think about a new line of thought, the neural groove hasn't been made, the resulting thought form is slow and uncertain because the mind is not yet accustomed to that particular nerve circuit. HPB makes this very point. Ordinary intellectual activity moves on well-beaten paths in the brain and does not compel sudden adjustments and destructions in its substance. But a new kind of mental effort calls for something very different, the carving out of new brain paths. Mahatma Kuthumi, in the Mahatma letters to AP Synod, said, "A person can only think in his well-worn grooves, and unless he has the courage to fill these up and make new ones for himself, he must perforce travel on the old lines." So the Mahatma teaches us that we need to make new neural grooves, particularly if we want to change our thinking habits and eliminate negative thinking. This is understood by science and medicine in the principle of synaptic or neural pruning. This is where certain cells or neurons in the brain are reduced or eliminated. That's the neural pruning, to allow for greater efficiency in thinking or of our body's response to stimuli. And the pruning cuts down on duplication of neurons and patterns that aren't used anymore. So when we want to change a pattern of thinking that focuses on the negative, neural pruning can take place as we reduce our thoughts that we don't want to repeat, and we can make new ones, as the master described. This can be difficult, and particularly as we are working on developing the ability to change our automatic reactions, like the body mind gets us into. It's difficult, but it can be done. Because thought precedes action, we're instructed by the spiritual teachers to be responsible in what goes on in our thinking. We can decide what goes on in our minds, and this is such an important part of being on the spiritual path. In the collection of Buddhist teachings, the Dhammapada, Buddha spoke about the debilitating effects of negative thoughts. Whatever an enemy may do to an enemy, far worse is the harm from one's own wrongly directed mind. We are what we think about. And this principle is emphasized in the Bible, in Proverbs, "As a man thinketh in his heart, so goes he." And you walk your thoughts. And the Polynesian and Hawaiian traditions have a principle that speaks to the power of thought, and it's called makia. Energy flows where your attention goes. Anytime we think of something, energy will flow into that thought, making it more likely to come up again. Again, in the Dhammapada, Buddha speaks about the importance of choosing well what we think about. Your worst enemy cannot harm you as much as your own thoughts unguarded. But once mastered, no one can help you as much not even your mother or your father. And again, in the Dhammapada, the watched mind brings happiness. The disciplined mind brings happiness. So what can be done to change our thoughts? So in my work as a therapist, clients may come to me with depression or anxiety. And in addition to processing some difficult events that might have happened in their lives, an important aspect of their change is to work on their thinking. This is part of a highly successful type of therapy called cognitive behavioral therapy. And it's evidence-based, meaning that there's evidence showing that it's useful. So this diagram speaks about CBT, and you can see that the thoughts are on the top. This is the most important part of the CBT triangle, as well as in our being on the spiritual path. So the thoughts are up there because they will overpower our feelings. We can change them depending on our attitudes, and then they affect our behaviors. Or the body with this section. We can be upset by things and the body can be tense. But thoughts can change that. Now this triangle shows the interplay between these three things. They're so very connected. And just a comment, these parallel the levels of consciousness in a human being that we got from Blavatsky. So there are several techniques that I teach clients to change their thinking patterns. And the ancient wisdom, including Theosophy, agree as to the usefulness of these practices on the spiritual path. One is thought stopping. Every time you think of an event that you don't want to recall, something or like something that was unfair or that hurt you, and resentment likely will come up. Stop and say to yourself, I will not think this way. And you think it with power. Then you replace it with a thought you have decided upon that would benefit you, such as understanding the person or the situation that bothers you, or seeing it from another person's point of view, thus moving into forgiveness. It can be a fake it till you make it kind of situation at the beginning. Then it becomes think it, and that's really what it needs. Think it till you make it. This reflects the power of our thoughts. And Aristotle chimed in on this. He said, we are what we repeatedly do. Excellence then is not an act, but a habit. So we can change the habits of our thinking that automatically come up in our minds by this technique. This is emphasized by Norman Vincent Peale, the American minister who wrote The Power of Positive Thinking. Change your thoughts and you change your world. On the spiritual path, we also need to look at our feelings that may be tied up in recurring thoughts that we want to change. So we can have all sorts of feelings in our day, but one of the most problematic that people have with is anger. And as you probably know, anger can be very harmful to us. It can make us feel sour, not in a good mood, and it can even affect our digestion and other things. And just a side note, these next few quotes illustrate how Theosophy, or the divine wisdom, includes the truths from cultural traditions around the world. From Hinduism, the Basavanna, from the Hindu sage in 12th century India, why do you get angry at someone who is angry at you? What are you going to gain from it? How can fire in your house burn your neighbor's house without engulfing your own? Or from the Jewish scripture, the Talmud, he who takes vengeance or bears a grudge acts like one who, having cut one hand while handling a knife, avenges himself by stabbing the other hand. These wise aphorisms depict the unity that is stated in Blavatsky's The One Life. We must let go of our hurts, because if we hurt another, we hurt ourselves, just like stabbing the other hand. We need to move into forgiveness so that it is more automatic. And it comes up in this next wise saying: the cheek doesn't get mad at the teeth for biting it while chewing. The cheek instantly forgives. And the same was true with all the masters we've learned from: Buddha, Jesus. This is also demonstrated by Nelson Mandela, the first president of South Africa after apartheid ended in 1990. He was imprisoned for 27 years because of his activism against the prior British government. When he was set free, he said, "As I walked out the door toward my freedom, I knew that if I did not leave all the anger, hatred, and bitterness behind, that I would still be in prison." So a useful piece about anger that Dora Van Gelder Kuntz said, and she was one of the founders of Therapeutic Touch, what nurses do for healing with energy coming off of the hands. She was the clairvoyant behind that, and she was president of the TS of America. She said we should only feel anger for a fraction of a second. This is long enough so that we can get the signal that something's wrong, but not long enough so that we vent it on anyone. So we need to figure out the cause of our anger and use problem-solving skills or good communication skills to resolve the issue. Because this can be difficult, it's important to calm our anger by using some behavioral strategies that affect our bodies, and particularly the body-mind, because the body-mind has that fight, flight, freeze aspect to it of the amygdala, and it's going to pump out adrenaline so that when we touch a hot stove, we pull our hand away really fast. So these are useful to repeat. You probably know these, but just to go over them, the calm breathing is the most important part of it. And that calms the amygdala, because when we're breathing calmly, the amygdala realizes, oh, I don't have to flee. Everything's fine. I don't have to get my adrenaline going. Also walking away, but that's peacefully. It's not walking away in anger. Repeating a calm phrase like breathe or relax. Feeling your pulse is one way to distract the body-mind. Closing your eyes, getting a drink of water, petting an animal, or talking it out to someone who cares, who can listen and help you identify what you need to do, maybe to find solutions. Otherwise, when you burn with the fire of anger, smoke gets in your eyes. So this wise aphorism, this is theosophy also, but the smoke clouds our vision and we get consumed by what we're angry at. And we can't figure out what we need or feel. And it also hampers our ability to see the effect that we're having on the other person. The smoke cuts us off from the wisdom of the higher mind and the inner spiritual self. Another problem with anger is expressed in the Yoruba religion of Africa by the saying, when water boils over the side of the pot, it smothers the flame. And this flame is the inner spiritual self. This is when the water, our emotions, boil over inside of us, and it smothers the flame of our intuition. As we work to improve ourselves and our emotions, we progress on the path, and to help reduce the anger and the frustrations we have, an important way to do this is to develop forgiveness. So Fred Luskin of the Stanford Forgiveness Project, he started this. He wanted to research forgiveness because prior to him, it was thought to be more of a philosophical idea rather than something that we need to do as people regularly. And he said that forgiveness was a life skill that had to be developed. He discovered that people who forgave had happier and healthier lives. They had increased vitality. They experienced less hurt, had less stress, were more optimistic, and more confident. And get this, if people only thought about forgiveness, their hearts and their nervous systems improved. So it clearly has an effect on our bodies. Now, very often, we human beings resist forgiveness because the personal self thinks it's equivalent to saying it's okay what the person did to us, or the injustice that was done, it's okay. The body mind objects to this, and you recall the chart that I showed you, and it holds on to grievances as a shield to protect itself from further hurt. And this is only an illusion because we remain vulnerable to more hurt because we're on the lookout for another slight. And we become hypersensitive to this. And it doesn't let ourselves heal and forget. Consequently, developing forgiveness is a perfect practice for treading the path and realizing the self. Wayne Dyer, the self-help and spiritual author, said, "Forgiveness is the most powerful thing you can do for yourself on the spiritual path." So how can we do this? One way to increase forgiveness is to use the good old CBT skills. Again, one of them is thought stopping and thought replacement. Now, this is consciously substituting our thinking with another statement, such as, I know my mother was doing her best. I can remember the positive things my father did. I can forgive and forget. These make use of the higher mind and the intuition to see things from a wider perspective. Then we're not as lost in the body mind. One more useful technique on the spiritual path to help us with forgiveness is called opposite action. Now, this is changing our actions to the opposite positive feeling or behavior. An example is forcing ourselves maybe to be nice to someone we're jealous of or angry at, or paying them a compliment. Now, we need to be sincere with this, but usually there's something positive in everybody, even somebody we disagree with. And this lessens the tension between the person and us, and does a lot for our development on the spiritual path. It is truly living out the one life. And then with this, we mute the effect of the body mind, which is the key. And a quote from the Quran teaches the same thing when it says, repel evil with what is better. Then will he, between whom and thee was hatred, becomes as if he were thy friend and intimate. And no one will be granted such goodness except those who exercise patience and self-restraint. And then another beautiful quote from Africa says, he who forgives ends the quarrel. HPB teaches us the way to forgiveness is compassion and altruism. The actual practice of altruism in deed, word, and thought purifies the covers of the soul. Now, those covers are the kama manas and the pranic level and the body mind. So altruism purifies these and permits its light to shine down into the brain mind. And that's what was told me, the body mind. And Blavatsky called it the brain mind. This light shining down into our brain mind is reflected in this quote from Daishonin Nichiren, the 13th century Japanese monk. And he said, we cannot hold a torch to light someone else's path without brightening our own. We need to help others. This light shining down is what we should all do on the spiritual path. HPB says the truest way to do this, practice altruism, is by combining philosophy with the highest outward and inward virtue. She teaches us to work on our virtues, and these are taught in the 6 perfections or Paramitas of Mahayana Buddhism. Now, this could be a talk in itself, but I'm wanting to go through them and particularly talk about the 5th one. But dana, and that's what we've been talking about with charity and love. And dana has the same root as our word donation. And shila, which is moral conduct. And the beautiful description of kashanti, patience sweet, which naught can ruffle. Now, vairagya is non-attachment. And this is a 7th one that was added by Blavatsky in The Voice of the Silence. And it's so important is because that's what we need to do to cultivate these other virtues, is not be invested in how things turn out. And then virya, fearlessness. And this I'm going to mention in a minute, but dhyana is meditation. So you can tell we're going higher in the levels of consciousness. And prajna is the wisdom of the self. But the heroism of virya is what we need to do to counteract our own defenses, which can be very strong, and everybody's got them. Then we can use opposite action to learn new responses. And virya comes from the inner spiritual self. It will never end. We can get it whenever we want. Now, other virtues on the spiritual path are described by Buddha's Noble Eightfold Path. And I'm wanting to particularly point out the 7th one, but I'm going to mention these. These are so important. Right view is what we need to have, and that's the right attitude. And the view from someone else's point of view, from their shoes. Right intention, right speech, right action, right livelihood. We need to be ethical in our livelihood. And what this does is it leads to sharing. and then altruism, and then right effort. This leads to the highest outcome. And then right mindfulness. This is for us to develop how we can be aware of what we're doing and not act unconsciously. Then, of course, the 8th is right concentration, and that's in meditation, which helps us tremendously. So Annie Besant chimes in when she says, the way to begin to tread the path that leads to the place of peace is to endeavor to identify our consciousness with the true self. And the means are disengagement from the objects of the senses. This is viragya. Carelessness as to the results of action, and meditation ever renewed on the true self. This is the main purpose of the spiritual path. HPB reinforces it when she says, true occultism is the destruction of the false idea of self, and that we're just our individual personality and body. Therefore, true spiritual perfection and knowledge are nothing else but the complete identification of our finite selves with the great all. As we travel the path, Theosophy teaches us to identify with this great all, and meditation is an important tool. And it can be difficult. And Dora Van Gelder says this to encourage us in our efforts. Meditation is often advocated as a relaxation technique to reduce stress, and it can be helpful. But meditation has much deeper aspects. Its greatest potential benefit lies in the fact that it offers access to dimensions of consciousness which lie beyond the personal self. She recommends that a good reminder or mantra that can be said out loud as a way to influence our thinking is, the self is peace. I am that peace. The self is I. The self is strength. I am that strength. The self is I. And so we're taught not to be discouraged when learning to meditate. The mind is so easily distracted, and it moves from thought to thought, just like the monkey mind. The monkey moves from vine to vine. And another way it's put is that thoughts and desires are like wave after wave coming into the shore. One thought, just like one wave, only stays for an instant, then another one comes in. The Hindu verses in the Bhagavad Gita describe the difficulty in controlling the mind when it says, the mind is as hard to control as the wind. And it's reiterated in the Theosophical classic, The Voice of the Silence. His thoughts become an army and carry him off, a captive slave. And trying to meditate is like this. The thoughts just enter in, but it may seem difficult to do. Charles Leadbeater, though, gives us some encouragement, and he was an early theosophical writer. He says that over time we will progress. Although a person in his daily meditation may see but little progress, a clairvoyant watching him will see exactly how the astral and mental bodies are slowly coming out of chaos into order, slowly expanding and gradually learning to respond to higher vibrations. Each effort is gradually thinning the veil that divides him from the world of direct knowledge. And this is knowledge of the inner spiritual self. And then, as Krishna says in the Dyaneshvari, then this path is beheld, whether one sets out to the east or to the west, to whatever place one would go. That place becomes one's own self. As we go about our lives, gradually we develop the awareness of our inner spiritual self. And lastly, HPB sums it up in the voice of the silence when she said, "Thou canst not travel on the path before thou hast become the path itself." Thank you.